And we're back. Hey, everybody. It's good to see y'all. Um, and again, my name is Devin. I'm an alcoholic. And I'm grateful that we're getting a chance to kind of dive into these traditions. I've been finding myself having more and more conversations about these ideas and these principles on all different levels of whether it's sponsorship or just in my own personal life. And so I always welcome an opportunity to get a chance to come and talk about these. I feel like Tradition 6 maybe more geared towards the AA side of things is and a little less towards the relationship stuff, although looking at what I have from Mike and what we had gone over, there is definitely some food for thought here as far as considering how this would look in a marriage or in other relationships. And and yeah, so this is one that's a mouthful. Even if when we look at the long form, there's so much in here that it'll just take a second to dive into it. But one of the things I'll point out now is kind of feel like we hit a little turning point once we get past the fifth tradition. And again, kind of similar to the steps. If you get past a fifth step, all of a sudden the conversation changes. This whole thing has been about you. And then you do a fifth step, and now it's about, man, I caused a lot of harm. I need to change. I need to get quiet and ask for some, to be changed here because I don't want to live how I've been living, and now I actually have some work to do in order to help me maybe change, which is to go and try to make these amends and start actually living different. And when we're leading up to the fifth tradition, we're talking a lot about unity and how we stay connected and how we stay in good relationships with each other. And that's not going to go away. But once we get to the primary purpose is for each group to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers, we start to notice that the next bunch of traditions all start referencing this is going to divert us from that primary purpose. So it's almost like we get brought up to let's stay connected. Here's how we stay connected. We use group conscience. We let all these people in. We get to make our own choices unless it's going to, impact others. And that's so that we can do the one thing that we're here to do, which is carry our group's message to the alcoholic who still suffers. And now the next bunch of traditions are going to talk about the next five are going to talk about the ways that we might get diverted as an entity or as a group from holding on to this one purpose. And I think that's just a really interesting way to look at the formatting of how this stuff's laid out. So when we get to tradition 6, an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. So that's how they end the tradition. They talk about what are we worried about with endorsing or financing or lending our name to somebody else and becoming affiliated with some outside enterprise or organization. Well, that could start to steer us away from the one thing that we're here to do, which is carry a message of recovery to an alcoholic who still suffers. And we do that for fun and for free. This isn't a pay to play situation, as we learned in our third tradition. You don't have to pay any money to be a member. There's no requirements for membership outside of you want to actually have a desire not to drink, you can be here. And so this idea, the underpinning of tradition 6, which we talk about a lot over here, is in AA, we cooperate, we don't affiliate. And so I'm going to read this long form, which is a dramatically different experience as far as how like what it says. It dives into a lot more specificity. So this is the long form of tradition 6, and it's much longer. Problems of money, property, and authority may easily divert us from our primary spiritual aim. We think, therefore, that any considerable property of genuine use to AA should be separately incorporated and managed, thus dividing the material from the spiritual. An AA group, as such, should never go into business. Secondary aids to AA, such as clubs or hospitals, which require much property or administration, ought to be incorporated and so set apart that, if necessary, they can be freely discarded by the groups. Hence, such facilities ought not to use the AA name. Their management should be the sole responsibility of those people who financially support them. For clubs, AA managers are usually preferred, but hospitals, as well as other places of recuperation, ought to be well outside AA and medically supervised. While an AA group may cooperate with anyone, such cooperation ought never to go so far as affiliation or endorsement, actual or implied. An AA group can bind itself to no one. That's a long, long form. So I want to jump back and kind of go piecemeal through this because I think there's a lot of different things in this. But what I'll talk about really quick is let me just look at what Bill actually wrote. Bill talks a little bit about what would happen if we started to diversify, which ultimately we're going to get into. We talk about primary purpose. We have one aim, and when we get into the 10th tradition, we talk about not having opinions on outside issues. But he talks a little bit about what would happen if we started to get involved in, um, trying to help in all sorts of aspects of society. And he goes, what if we tried AA hospitals, or what if we tried to turn an AA group into a business? Ultimately we're going to be failing, and people are going to start asking, does AA fix drunks, or is it an educational project? Is it spiritual? Is it medical? Is it a reform movement? What is this whole thing really about? If we started getting involved in all these different facets of trying to be helpful all across the globe. And it says, we saw we'd soon be mired in politics. Even inside AA, we found it imperative to move the AA name from clubs and 12-step houses. And then he goes on to talk about this guy who gets approached to get involved in. I don't even know why they tell this story, to be honest, because it's not really a story here about affiliation. It's a story about anonymity. So we'll disregard that one. But they talk about a guy who's an AA member who gets approached to be a representative of Alcoholics Anonymous on a liquor board, like a trade board association for alcohol, and is an advertising executive, and they want to put his whole name and that he's an AA member on as the board member for this thing, and ultimately it was made very clear that would be an anonymity break. It wouldn't necessarily even be about affiliation. It would be about this guy breaking his anonymity to public level. And so he doesn't go do it. But I don't understand why they put that story in the essay around tradition 6, to be honest. But so I'm going to jump back to this long form and just to read the tradition one more time. They say here that so I think we've talked about this, that each one of these traditions, it asks us to look out for something within ourselves. What am I being asked to give up here? What am I being shown as potentially dangerous for me as an individual, for me as a group? If my group starts to be lauding over money, property, and prestige, the group may start to divert from the primary purpose. If I'm out here looking for money, property, or prestige amongst my peers, I could start. Those are things I could start worshiping. In our chapter to the agnostic, we talk about how we worship false idols. We talk about how we felt this power of God come to us in moments of real need, and then that sense of power gets blotted out by worldly clamors, or by worship of other things, by pomp, by calamity. It gives us these ways that we could lose sight of this belief or this connection to spirit. And so here in tradition 6, it says, hey, like we're trying to not affiliate with or by endorsing, financing, or lending our name to anybody else so that we don't become beholden to any of these things or get worried about money, property, or prestige. Because if we start worrying about those things or walking down those roads, we're going to stop forgetting that this is for fun and for free, and this is about helping alcoholics stay sober, that this is about unconditional love of opening our hearts and giving of ourselves so that other people might have a chance to recover just as people did with us. And then in the long form, it says problems of money, property, and instead of prestige, they use the word authority. So to me, these are the watchwords here within tradition 6. Like these are things I can start to worship that can actually start diverting me personally from what is my primary aim here. My primary purpose was really given to me in our 12th step. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So I have a purpose now. I came here and I hated the world and I was suicidal and I didn't know how to live. And you guys gave me a purpose, that my purpose was, hey, if you actually woke up here and if this program really works for you, then your job is to go and help somebody else like we did with you. And guess what? If you do that, not only will you see that, you won't really see that as work because you will have an immense joy in getting to watch other people recover. And you're going to build a fellowship around you. And we're sure you're not going to want to miss that. And so now I'm looking at, well, what's going to divert me from that? Well, worship of money, property, authority, prestige. Those are all things that could get in the way of me going and helping an alcoholic. And the way Bill writes it in the long form, he says these things may easily divert us. So it's not even like it's got to get worked in there. It's like I can, these are shiny objects that my ego wants to latch onto and go after. Because who doesn't want money, property, and authority? Don't you want to be the boss? I want to be the boss. I want to tell people what to do. I want you to listen to me. I want to control you. That's my whole problem. Who doesn't want some money? Well, that's security in this world. I got to pay bills. I want nice things. I want to take care of people. I want to go, we all, there on some level, there's a need for that. But then I have a mind that wants more. What about property? Well, of course I want more property. But the administration over that and the worry that can come. You ever see people that are, and maybe this is a thing over here, but I mean, I've met people that have massive bank accounts. They have big jobs and they have all the money in the world and they have the family and the kids and the whole thing. And they're still walking around worried about money and security. And at least what I've experienced is more money coming in does not necessarily get rid of the fear around the money, right? So these are things that maybe I need to watch out for always, because they can start to divert me from my real purpose here is to humbly serve my creator and try to go help some people, for fun and for free. And so there's a line there, there's a need for all of us to be able to support and pay our bills. And it would be great for us to save some of that and be able to set ourselves up for an easy life, A+, everyone deserves that in my book. But if I start getting, imagine this, imagine an AA group that starts trying to have a business. I mean, we argue over here about what kind of coffee and cookies to put out at the meeting. Imagine if we actually had some kind of bank account with like a couple of $1,000s in it, that's starting to grow because we're starting to make money. I mean, are we going to come to the meeting and be thinking about how are we helping the newcomer, and are we carrying an effective, attractive message to somebody? Or are we going to be talking about who's going to get all that money that we've been making? How are we going to split that up? And so I think it's one of those things where when we think about this in a group dynamic, of course we can start getting off the track. When money gets involved in a group conversation, it gets messy. You ever go out, maybe you guys go out and, try to split the bill at the cafe you're at. Does that ever get weird? You ever go to the diner after an AA meeting with 10 people trying to figure out where do we got to, how much money did everybody pay? And some guy just put like $5 on the table and walked out, but he got a cheeseburger and a milkshake and a dessert. And he probably owed $30, but he just dropped $5 and left. And now everyone's going, where's this other $20? And you're starting to argue amongst each other of, well, I already, so we can see, I think, through maybe some simple, dumb examples that money is an easily arguable thing. And if that's what I become focused on, it can stop it can start taking me away. And so what do they mean by this? We think, therefore, that any considerable property of genuine use to AA should be separately incorporated and managed, thus dividing the material from the spiritual. And then they talk about secondary aids to AA, such as clubs or hospitals, which require much property and administration, ought to be incorporated and so set apart, so that if necessary, they can be freely discarded by the groups. So what we're talking about here, and maybe you guys have this over there, but what we have a lot of times, at least in New York, we have the workshops in the city. There's a 12th Street workshop, there's Perry Street, there's Midnight. These are kind of like what you consider to be an AA clubhouse of sorts. And then if you go outside of urban cities, and even in some of the cities, they'll have some of these. But if you're more out and more like anywhere USA, you'll see things like an Alano Club or a Friendship House. And these tend to be a building that some people take over. You know, maybe someone has some extra money and they say, hey, we can go and like buy this building and make it an AA clubhouse for our community. And what they'll do is they'll buy some kind of, you know, cheap piece of property somewhere. They'll get a board together with a chunk of people, and then they'll open the doors and say, hey, if you're an AA group or you want to start an AA group, you know, we're going to have meetings the clock round here, you know. And so and like where my parents live in Indianapolis, there's the Carvel Club in Indianapolis, or there's the Suburban North is another club. And you go there and there's meetings like all day long, from the early morning into later in the evening. There's all, you know, there's like 5 to 8, maybe more meetings every single day in one of these places. And they usually have a guy who or a lady who works there, and they sell some coffee and they sell some food and they'll have literature, and you know, it's all kind of managed by that club. Now you notice the name has nothing to do with AA. Suburban North, Carvel Club, Alano Club. I mean, the Alano clubs are the ones that sound the closest like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? But it doesn't actually have AA in the name. And so if I'm a group and I go to Suburban North or I go to the Carvel Club and I say, hey, we got a need for a Tuesday night meeting at 7 o'clock, and we notice that you don't have a meeting there. Could we come in? They say, cool, you can come in. It's $25 a meeting. And you go, man, we're a small group, but we can sort out $25 a week. We'll do it. And then maybe the property taxes go up or cost of living goes up. And all of a sudden that landlord, which is this club, it's an AA club, and it's a, you know, all recovery all the time. It's an AA thing. They'll come to us and they'll say, hey, like our rent just got jacked up. We're going to need $50 a meeting now. Now, if that was like a formally binding agreement, right, where we were like in contract with this company, we would be like, man, this is AA, we have to pay $50. Like all of a sudden we'd be screwed. You know, if we had signed a lease like with an actual or become incorporated, or we were an actual business entity that was like renting that space, not just the informal agreements that most of the time an AA group has. You know, we might be screwed and in a bind. And now that contract might be, you know, we might not be able to adhere to those terms. And now someone's got to come up with this money. If we sign like a year lease, like if an apartment or something in New York City, I mean, imagine if my AA group tried to sign a year lease in Brooklyn in our neighborhood, we'd be on the hook for like anywhere from 25 to, you know, $100 a month or something. You know, that's a lot of money for an AA group to try to pull in, right? And that's what they're talking about with these clubs. If somebody decides we want to make a house into an AA refuge, well, they're going to have to pay the property taxes, and they're going to have to pay whatever the mortgage is. And there's a lot of fees with, you know, any kind of maintenance. There's a lot of money that has to go into managing a property like that. And an AA group should never really be in charge of something like that. So what has happened is in all those situations, maybe AA people will get together and they'll pool some money and they'll get a board of directors and they will separately incorporate and try to make one of those facilities. And then they will make it available to AA groups. But what it does is it frees up the AA group to not have to be beholden to that kind of a contract. So if all of a sudden you come to me and our group is small, we can't do $50 a meeting, and they say it's $50 a meeting, we go, okay, we're going to have to go find a new landlord. We're going to have to go to a church or some other house of worship or reach out in our community and find out. Maybe we'll use someone's backyard for a little bit until we can get situated. You know what I mean? But so that's what they're talking about with we're not here to endorse, finance, or lend our name. And then let's think about it more in the public eye. What would happen if AA, we've had a bunch of controversies around the treatment industry over in this country. Maybe it's just over here, but there's been members of AA that um, have run some of these places, and then it comes out that there was tons of fraud. There was insurance fraud. There was sexual abuse. There was horrible things going on in these treatment facilities or something. And what if Alcoholics Anonymous decided to say, we're going to get behind this is one of our members and he's going to go do this treatment program and we're going to get on board and, we're going to affiliate with, whatever, black shale recovery centers or whatever, you know what I mean? And then what happens if they come out and have all these problems and it turns out the place was terrible? It's going to look really bad for AA. You guys endorse these people? They were abusing, they were taking extra insurance payout. They were all kinds of criminal activity was going on at that place. And so we don't want to ever get involved in endorsing or lending the name Alcoholics Anonymous to any other organization, because what happens if some other organization actually is not really above board with what they're doing, or they get into some kind of public controversy, or even it could be as simple as they go out and just lay claim to some kind of political argument. Right now over in this country, there's a massive divide politically. People just aren't seeing eye to eye, and it can be very contentious. And so what would happen, and this is ultimately what we'll get into with the 10th tradition, but they're very linked here. What would happen if an AA group or Alcoholics Anonymous as a whole said, we think this is a great company. We think Hazelden, who's been a great friend of AA, is a wonderful company, and we're going to endorse Hazelden, and we love Hazelden. But what if Hazelden then gets some new editor in chief or new CEO who is out there actively supporting a political campaign, and it becomes one of those black marks that, oh, that's a company that leans on the right or leans on the left? And think about how many millions of people in this country would then look at Alcoholics Anonymous and say, man, Alcoholics Anonymous is affiliated with a company that aligns themselves with this politics or this religion or this idea. And that could turn a bunch of people off from ever coming here. So we don't want to ever affiliate, because that's going to lump AA as an entity into whatever decisions that company then makes. And that could ultimately be something really negative for us. And the main thing here with wanting to be separately incorporated. So like you guys, I'm assuming, have central offices. We have a New York Intergroup as our, New York, like in Manhattan, the central office, and they have an office. We pay rent. We have we actually have an office you can go to on 7th Avenue, in the neighborhood Chelsea, kind of in Midtown. And, it costs a decent amount of money for that to operate, but that's supported by the groups, which we're going to find out. And, when we start talking about Tradition 7 and self-support, that the groups support our service bodies. Meaning that if my home group has extra money, they're going to contribute more money to our central office, to our area, to the general service office for, US and Canada over here. And so the groups subsidize that money because we see that as a viable service. But if all of a sudden that became too much money for the groups to support, and the New York Intergroup had to fold, or even the general service office over here. I mean, they're not doing so hot financially right now. There's a lot of money being spent on a lot of stuff. And a lot of people over here are not very pleased with the way the finances are going, all the way at the bottom of our triangle with the general service office and AA World Services. If they were to fold, my home group will still meet. And I think that's the real point about this, is it's saying that any massive service entity or massive aid to AA, like a club or a central office, that's all great. But if that were to have financial problems, my group is not responsible or is not going to have to be on the hook to fix that. That if all of a sudden AA General Services went under and the office that we have in uptown, or our central office at New York Intergroup had to fold and go bankrupt, then my home group, No Serenity Till Brooklyn, will still have 4 meetings a week, and we will still show up and be meeting. That we're not affiliated with that organization. We cooperate with them. We give them our money, and we see them as a vital entity for us to be able to serve the community of AA in our area. So we contribute money to those service bodies. But if they end up having to fold, that's not going to impact my group. And I think that's what this is about, that the groups are free to move around, because the group itself, your home group, is not on the hook for whatever the kind of contract is for an actual piece of property or a lease. And they talk about the management of these facilities there's usually a board of directors that come in. We have a steering committee and we have a board of directors at New York Intergroup. And those are members that volunteer, but that there's ultimately a board that gets formed. And those are the people that become responsible for the decisions. And we have an executive director, and that's a paid staff person who's in charge of managing that facility. And they have a couple of staff. And so there's people that have jobs there to deal with that. And if it were to go under, then they're the ones that are like working there and are legally, that's their profession. It's not going to be the AA groups that have to bear the brunt of whatever those consequences are. And then they talk about hospitals and other places of recuperation, like detoxes, treatment facilities. AA takes meetings into those places, but we don't put our name on them. I've been taking meetings into psych units and detoxes and hospitals and correctional facilities for over a decade now. And the first thing I sit down and tell everybody when I get to a meeting as an AA member is, I want to thank you for sitting down with us. I know this isn't required. And if you guys don't come to the meeting, it'll just be us talking to ourselves. So thank you for that. And what I need you to know is I'm just an alcoholic. I'm a drunk off the street. I'm not affiliated with this facility in any way. I'm not paid to be here, but this is a part of my 12-step service and my 12-step of recovery, and how I stay sober here is to come out and do service and try to find people like me that are lost and don't know that they can recover. And so we make it really clear that the 12 steps is a program that anybody can utilize. So a lot of these treatment programs, at least over here, will maybe you'll see big books, and you'll have some groups where they talk about Alcoholics Anonymous or any of the other 12-step recovery fellowships, like Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Debtors Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous. We've given our program, the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, we've made that public. Like, anybody can take this and run with it. Just if you change the words, don't call it the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's what everyone's done. It's the 12 steps of Narcotics Anonymous, and 12 steps of Overeaters Anonymous or Debtors Anonymous. You can personalize this to whatever problem that you're going to apply this program to. And that's what we mean by we cooperate with everybody. Our program is not uniquely ours. It's not a secret, but we don't stop anybody from using it. But we just don't affiliate with professionals in that way. What we're doing is for fun and for free. Come and make use of what we have. That's great. If you want to change it, you can change it. We're here to cooperate with you. But we're going to just stick to what we do. And we're going to keep ourselves separate over here, so that we don't end up having outside influence, and we don't end up being lumped in with anybody else's decisions, that we can just stay over here. We have one job to do. We have no opinion on anything else that's going on. And within the service structures of AA, any of these massive things like central offices that do come in and sign legal contracts and have, budgets and have all this stuff, that, the AA group is insulated from that. And we'll try to support them. But if my central office, like New York Intergroup, folds, or we've had Brooklyn Intergroup or Queens Intergroup, and other counties within New York City have come up and gotten their own offices going, and if some of them fold, that would be a tragedy. But it's not going to impact my home group's ability to meet and carry the message of recovery that is in our big book. And so to me, that's the big thing here of what we're talking about. An AA group doesn't go into business. Um, and so I'll tell a quick story. Part of the deal here in the pandemic was that I was on the board. I became a board member of our central office. I was originally a member of our steering committee as the Brooklyn area representative, which meant that I was the point of contact for the groups within Brooklyn, New York, to then, sit and try to bring the conscience of the groups to the discussion within the central office steering committee. Each one of our counties, like Queens, New York, or Manhattan, Staten Island, the Bronx, Brooklyn all had a representative, and then there was, some other positions for different parts of service that we had that serve on the steering committee. And then there's the chair, the alternate chair, the secretary, and the treasurer that become the board members, the actual executive board. And then we have an executive director and a few staff. So I was just a member of the steering committee. Then our secretary abruptly resigned in the middle of a meeting in a bit of a contentious way. It was kind of funny because you're kind of yelling at it. He was passionate about something, and we realized that like the only thing you could do to, punctuate, you couldn't just get up and walk out of the room. All he could do was just kind of like close the monitor of his computer. So he said his piece and then just like close the laptop. But so I became the de facto secretary and then found somebody who could replace me in Brooklyn, and I became the secretary, which meant I became a board member of New York Intergroup and finished out that term. And in the beginning of the pandemic, it was brought to us by our director at the time, and that Zoom, this platform that we're on today, this company Zoom, had this level of an account that would cost us like $15,000 like once. We'd pay 15 grand and we would have a year subscription of like a ton of meetings. Like we'd have like, basically 1,500, meeting rooms or whatever. And we could use that to help, give licenses for all the local groups to be able to have a meeting space, because in this we're talking like this is the end of March before anyone has figured out any of this stuff, and it's like so new. And we're hearing one time $15,000, that's like our literature budget, or that's like 1 month's rent or a little bit, and our rent is being suspended by the city, so okay, we could do that. So our discussion was kind of simple, like, well, if we can, this is not that much of a commitment here, given the financial burden that's being we're getting relief from based on whatever thing is going on with rent payments being suspended. So let's do it. The problem was that our director and our chair, the alternate chair position was vacant, but our chair, our secretary, and our director at the time, none of them really read the contract. They took the word of the director. And the problem was that slight error was that it wasn't $15,000 once, it was $15,000 per month. And then in the first couple of weeks, we added a bunch more stuff and became this like global entity where people from all over the world were finding out about New York Intergroup was giving out Zoom rooms. So we had meetings from the UK and South Africa and probably, India, all over the place that were basically starting to utilize this, enterprise Zoom account that New York Intergroup was paying for. And what it ultimately ended up being was about $250,000 contract for a year that we signed with the company Zoom. It was about $20,000 a month, if not more, for us to get all the stuff that account was. And let me tell you this, my experience was for the better part of a year, every single time that steering committee and board met, and every single time we met with the groups that we served in the New York area for our quarterly meetings, all we talked about was the Zoom contract and how much money it was going to cost and how are we going to pay for this and all that stuff. We got ourselves into a position where we had considerable property that we now had to pay for. And we got ourselves in a position where we had a significant need for financial aid to come in for us to not default that loan or that obligation. And here's what we didn't talk about. For a year, we did not talk about the alcoholics within our area, within New York City, that don't have access to the internet and connectivity. We have a massive shelter system. We have a massive unhoused population within New York City. There's a lot of alcoholics here that don't have technological tools that most people think we take for granted. And we're in the middle of a global medical emergency or whatever you'd call it, right? And all we're talking about is the money because we got involved in a thing where we became affiliated with this company Zoom. We signed an actual legally binding contract for effectively $250,000. And so for my money, when it says that if we get involved in having a lot of property, or we get involved in having large amounts of money to discuss, or we get involved thinking at that point that we were going to be, our director was like, we're going to be the savior of AA. We're going to save New York City AA. We have to save all these groups, which is a noble pursuit. But it kind of looks like you're kind of going after some prestige or authority here. If we get involved in those ideas and those start to become the governing force here, we didn't talk about, how can we do a better job of carrying this message of recovery to the alcoholic who may not have connectivity, who might have accessibility issues to virtual meeting spaces? Is there anything we can do in our local community to make sure that we're getting literature and books and some kind of resources out to community centers and places where there's going to be drunks sitting there that maybe don't have a smartphone or the internet? And we didn't have one discussion about that for the first year, and maybe not even ever, of the pandemic, because we signed this contract immediately. And then it was a big, whoa, whoops. That's every month that we owe him 20 grand, which is one of the reasons why our secretary ultimately decided he had to walk away. And, and it was amazing. It was a huge threat to our unity and a huge threat to potentially the office. Now, the amazing part is that, people that were using the rooms were contributing money, and, that somehow was able to be afforded. I mean, somehow we were able to float that because it seemed like every group that used a meeting ended up giving us about $20 a month or so. And we'd have about 1,000 different groups going on. So we were able to cover that. But man, was it contentious. And it showed me the importance of what this tradition is talking about. That within AA, if my group gets involved in some kind of a business venture and all of a sudden we have to worry about money or rent, or if we're starting to think that we're the big, we're important, or if we start having some authority, that is one of the fastest ways for us to stop having discussions around, are we being effective in carrying this message to the alcoholic who still suffers? And for my money, that's really what this is all about, that the AA group needs to stay separate from those matters. We'll talk about being self-supporting next week, and we pay rent. We have to make arrangements with our landlords where we give them something. We have to come to an agreeable term. And usually people are pretty fair with us because they understand what we're doing, because we aren't affiliating with entities, and we are seen as this is what we are. We're not here for any money. We're not trying to make money off you. We're not trying to sell you anything. We're just here trying to help people for fun and for free. And so a lot of houses of worship and faith leaders will jump on board with that message and want to help, and will give us a fair deal. And so we pay our own way so we can stand on our own 2 feet. But if we're going in and signing legal contracts. I mean, look, we have Perry Street is a small studio apartment sized ground floor in a brownstone in the West Village. It costs $10,000 a month for this space to exist. Imagine that. It's an AA club that costs $10,000 a month. And they have meetings. They probably have 8 or 10 meetings every single day. And they need your money. I mean, they want you there, but they have, a need for finances. And so the way that operates is they have a board, they have members, and they have, people in the AA community that sign on and are members of the board that have to make decisions about how to run that space. And that's if any of the meetings that utilize that space ever were priced out because it costs too much money, those meetings could go find a church or someone's apartment or some other place to go. They're not beholden to that legal contract like the space and the board members sign on to do. So let me look at it. Mike's. I've read this one a few times, or looked over this a few times, but the way he wrote this is, I think, interesting. Where he kind of talks about um, what could divert us from our primary purpose in a marriage, and what he says is he wrote tradition 6 as a partner ought not be overly supportive, spiritually, emotionally, or physically to the marriage or relationship, lest problems of ego gratification divert him or her from the primary purpose. Um, he says this tradition is important in protecting the relationship and its unity. It keeps each member responsible for themselves. No person can meet all the needs of another. We're responsible to take care of ourselves, but are enhanced by our association to each other. Our separateness is our mutual strength. It promotes it promotes a relationship of healthy equals. A partner should be supportive spiritually, emotionally, and physically to the relationship, but a mature partner doesn't do for the other what he or she should do for themselves. Doing so could promote an inflated ego, which would divert the primary purpose of the relationship, which is hopefully to express God's love and not one's own self will. You will note that God does not do for us what you should and can do for yourself. He only helps when you need something beyond your own power. This is part of God's love for us. He realizes that to help us when we can help ourselves is to cripple us, and that he would never do. So I think in this, the way Mike is looking at this and what makes sense to me here is I'm here to be supportive in my marriage, and I'm here to support people through sponsorship and through friendship. But if I'm out here doing more for you, then that can become an ego feeding proposition for me. And that's something that I have to watch out for. If I'm coming out here and spiritually, emotionally, or physically saying, I will do everything and I'm here to do everything for you, in a sense, that's just me kind of figuring out how to wrap you around to bend you to do whatever I think I might want you to do. And then I become this I'm bigger than, better than. And I feel like that opens the door for me to start getting to that place where if you don't do what I suggest, well, don't look at all the things I do for you, you know, and that could really get me in trouble. And that could get me in trouble in relationships when I start to see that that's, it's building up this tally sheet of self-seeking. I will do all these things for you, but that means you must bend to my wishes at all times. And that's going to really be getting me in trouble. So he wrote some more, and I'll share the whole rest of the thing. Let me just look at really quick. Those partners should complement one another, not be crutches for one another in any area of the relationship. And the caution here is that being totally dependent upon another person isn't living, and it is surely not love. This tradition protects each individual's identity in the relationship and thus preserves the unity of the relationship. Our best relationship is one where dependence is mutual, the independence is equal, and the obligation is reciprocated. And then let me see a few of the questions that he has. How can one become spiritually dependent upon another? How can you hear God's voice or receive guidance while arguing? What is meant by our separateness is our mutual strength? What is meant by allowing your loved one the dignity to fail? And so he has a bunch of other questions here. Do you allow your grown children to be adults, or do you continue to accept the consequences for their mistakes by fixing their problems, getting them out of trouble, continuing to assume their financial responsibilities, etc.? Are you helping your partner or contributing to making someone a cripple, spiritually, emotionally, or physically? We could probably update that one for PC reasons there, Mike. Um, Karthik has a hand up, and yeah, I'm going to stop. I think that's, kind of fleshed out most of this stuff. But go ahead, brother.
Yeah. So question one, the questions you read out for for Mike, they don't seem to be related to money, property, or prestige. Yeah, they're very important questions, but how are they related to money, property, or prestige?
So I guess what I see with the writing of this one is to take the idea here and to personalize this towards a marriage. And in that sense, we're looking at, some of his questions here, would be like, hey, do you allow your partner or do you allow your children to actually make these mistakes, or are you constantly getting them out of trouble financially? Are you constantly getting them out of trouble from all these other things? So I think you see some of that coming up here, where it's saying, hey, if you're becoming the person who's just fixing everything and taking an outsized role in this relationship, then that can become an ego feeding process for you. And I think that's what we're talking about with money, property, and prestige. Those are AA groups, if you will, taking an outsized role in society or in the community around them of what their place really is. So I think again, one member's interpretation of the underlying principle, trying to put it towards a marriage. Um, and I find that there's some good food for thought here. When I'm thinking about tradition six and I'm looking at me personally, I'm looking at what you're talking about. Is it possible that if I'm starting to worship money or property or authority or prestige, that those things are going to start stepping in the way of the job that I've been asked to do here as an AA member, which is to go and try to be, living a life of love and service out in the world around me. And so the quickest ways for me to stop living of love and service, I'm going to start worshiping property, prestige, authority, or money. And if I'm able to look at those things, which are all in a sense materialistic desires, if I'm able to watch personally for where do I have materialistic desires that start to crop up with me that I start to obsess over and start to feel like I have to have them, is it possible then that the actions I start taking as I move through the world start putting me in positions where I'm less available to actually go out and be genuinely loving and of service to the world around me? And so for me, that's kind of how I personally will think about the money, property, and prestige. And it's maybe slightly
So,
different than what Mike was writing, which is just trying to look at it towards a marriage. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so the second question is, usually we say that, two A members cannot start a business together because you are not supposed to be affiliated with money, property, and prestige, but I kind of don't believe it if, both of them trust each other and trust their recovery. So it's just like opening a business with an outsider. So that's my point of view. But I was just wondering, what is your thought process on two A members getting together to start a financial business, anything that is related to material?
Sure. And we've talked about this before. And I think a little bit of this goes around the eighth tradition, which talks about we're non-professionals. But the main thing here, as I kind of would clue in on, is if I'm an AA member, but I'm also a professional musician. I have a career. You know what I mean? And it would be absolutely ridiculous if at some point I met another member of Alcoholics Anonymous who's also a professional musician and we hit it off and we realized we could make a band and make some cool music together. It would be absolutely insane for us to not go do that, in my opinion. So what I do as a professional and what my career is really has no bearing on my membership in AA. So if I'm a person of and I have a certain background of a certain career and I run into somebody in AA and we realize, man, we've got a lot of overlap here and we have some cool ideas that we could pursue. That's not a venture of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's a venture of two professionals that are getting into business. So it should have no bearing on AA because I'm not going to print my name on the board of that I'm not going to put on the liner notes of this band, Devin Collins, drummer, member of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know what I mean? We're not going to be affiliated with AA in any way. It's two adults making a choice of getting into business with each other. And the only problem that I could offer, or that what could happen, is if a business goes south, did that potential failing and the relationship that might get fractured as a result, depending on how people conduct themselves, could filter back into your AA community. It could split, well, I'm friends with Joe, and Joe seems like he was the good guy, and Dan was the guy who really screwed him over there. So, and then those guys are like, no, man, I'm friends with Dan, and Joe sucks, and so you could see like a friend group, like with any failed relationship, could start to splinter. But I would say that, AA doesn't have an opinion. What you're doing outside of AA as a professional, as a human being, is totally not within the scope of Alcoholics Anonymous. We have one purpose here, to carry a message of recovery from alcoholism. If people end up connecting because they're alcoholics and can look at doing some work together, as far as I can tell in all of our literature, AA doesn't have any opinion on that. The only opinion we would have is, don't put the AA name on your business. you know, let's not drag AA potentially through the mud if something goes sideways, and let's not potentially have the pitfall where we look at AA as this really special thing if things go great, and either side of that could be a negative for us. We're just, hey, we're over here just doing our thing. And if people end up sober, and there's a lot of really brilliant people in AA. So some brilliant people decide to get together and maybe create something that the world needs, would be wonderful. And you'll see that with a lot of treatment stuff. A lot of AA guys out here, they get involved. They want to start sober livings, and some of them put together really great programs. And you'll see a lot of people really get sober because there was an AA member that said, look, you know, we want clinical stuff, yeah, but hey, these people need to get involved with a program of recovery, and they start getting outside speakers and getting people to meetings, and they really make a program that kind of pushes you into trying to get you sober and get a sponsor and start working the steps. And you'll see people coming out of there with a much better shot at getting sober. And that's members of Alcoholics Anonymous that have really had an experience and said, hey, we think we could help people. So I think that's a to thine own self be true, and perhaps maybe a part of the fellowshipism, things that get said enough times in meetings and around the fellowship that we start to think are the truth. But if you really just look at the literature, maybe it's not in there. And to me, that's I just play dumb. If it's not in the literature, then I will understand that that's a member's perspective. And there's a lot of really helpful perspectives from AA members, but that may not be actually what AA is saying. And and if you look at all the letters and the essays here, when a member reaches out to Bill or reaches out to the General Service Office and go, what do you guys think about this? The office's response is, oh, we don't know. This is what we've tried. If you want to do it, we don't think it's a good idea, but let us know. The General Service Office is never telling people what to do. They're just saying, hey, we don't know if that's a great idea, but if you do it, let us know how it goes. And that's what I was talking to my friend Marita. You had hit me up about a question, and she was our trustee at large out here. And I called her and I said, Marita, what's it like to travel all over the world and be talking to all these other central offices? And she goes, oh, it's wild. She's like, I'm going to Mongolia this weekend, and I was over here in this country. And she goes, and I'll show up and they'll tell me what they're doing, and they'll show me what they got going on. And she'll go, wow, that's not how we do it. That's really interesting. Let us know how that goes. you know. Go ahead, Karan.
Yeah, my question are twofold. I have two. One is extrapolating to Karthik's last question about whether two A members can get into a professional arrangement. How would that relationship change if they were connected by sponsors? Would the weight be different? Because the pros and cons are much higher at stake. And I have another question, which is related to the questions that you read from Mike. I just wanted to know, how does it translate into your relationships? Because it talks a lot about dependence and interdependence and being mutually a bit distant, allowing the individual to grow. Uh, Looking at it, it requires a lot of emotional maturity in terms of doing that, and any of your personal experience would really help. Looking from my standpoint, I'm a 32-year-old single guy in a family, a joint family like that. Yeah.
Those are great questions. Well, on the sponsor one, and maybe this is again, I'm not an authority here, right? So you're getting my feelings right now sitting here on December 9th of 2025. Um, I'm an AA member, that's it. Um, but when I think about the sponsorship thing, I know there's people and there's parts of the country here or different groups where that's like such an ingrained thing, like, this sponsor family thing. Um, I don't think the sponsor deal really matters much. It's like everyone's free to do whatever. I don't have any control. I sponsor in quotes. I'll put sponsor in quotes because the joke is like about half the people that would call me sponsor probably actually reach out and we do some work together. There's a bunch of people that will talk to me for 2 weeks and then I'll see them a year later after not talking to them in months and they'll be like, oh yeah, my sponsor's here. And I'm like, oh, I guess I sponsor that person. So I don't tell anybody what to do. I have no authority over anybody's life. Like my job is this is what I've done. I'm going to share my experience with you. And if you want what I have, you might want to do what I do. And so I don't see necessarily that would be, I could infer that perhaps more of the question is about like, hey, this could really impact a whole entire group of people. And I think that is kind of the deal.
Yeah. My question was, if the two people who are getting professionally connected, would they a sponsor and a sponsee? Would that?
Well, that could be interesting. I've seen that actually with uh my friend who started, my buddy started a treatment center and then he hired, one of his guys who was fired up, who became one of the clinicians and, then ultimately became a marketer. And all I know is that my buddy, who was the sponsee at the time, their relationship moved into, this is my boss. And all of a sudden, a lot of the inventory or the 10 steps were about the sponsor because the sponsor was now the boss. So, he realized that like, man, if I'm going to be in business with this guy, I probably need somebody else to be running all this stuff by because I can't call the guy that was just like, fired up at the meeting earlier today that kind of pissed me off. I can't call him 2 hours later and tell him how he pissed me off. Like I gotta, maybe you could, but so I would say in that regards it could be the kind of thing where you might want to have that discussion ahead of time. Hey, if right now I'm kind of being the spiritual advisor but we're going to get involved in business together, you know that might present situations where I might not be able to be the most effective advisor here because now our relationship is moving in a different direction. So perhaps you'd want to go and find somebody that um you know like maybe that's where we would need to move things to. And that would be an interesting point. And I think sometimes that could really work wonderful, depending on what the business is and what the job is. If it's high pressure, high stakes, got to make it happen. Or if it's like, hey, man, like I'm just a manager at this store and I can get you a job. And like, there's not much to it. I just need you to go and do a few simple things. And like, even if you're not that great at it, it's not a problem, then that's not really going to do much. But if you're like starting a business and it's high pressure, and then it could be maybe a little different. And then with my marriage and our relationship, I mean, I think that's part of what has really made it a beautiful thing is that we are both people that are relatively independent. We seem to be two people that met at a moment in time where we were not necessarily subscribing to what so many people would talk about as my partner is supposed to complete me, that they're my other half, it's like we were both like two complete people. She's just well balanced and grounded. So she has the ability to process emotions and go through the world in a way that I just don't have. And I was in a position though in sobriety where I was starting to have regular work, was starting to be able to show up in this world, was able to pay, start to pay all my bills and like have a life going on. And so I had a lot of stuff on my calendar that was I've got a lot of obligations here. I've got a lot of different things on the calendar. So I want to spend time with you, but I have this life going on. And so we kind of met where we were both two people that were relatively independent and enjoyed spending time with each other. And that's kind of been what the relationship has continued. We're two people that really are just enjoy spending time with each other. And we really have, in my opinion, we've had a wonderful relationship blossom from that, where it's like, not to say that I'm okay if she's gone, because that's totally, after 12 years, that would be devastating, right? But it's not like, oh my God, you're the person that is doing all these things, and without you, I'm nothing. It's like, we both have our lives and we go out. She has a career, I have a career, and we get to enjoy time together. And it seems like we're really welcomed additions to each other that make us, in my opinion, made me a way better person. And so it's like, that's an amazing thing, but she's not the driver of all that. It's like, I have a spiritual program. I have a relationship with my creator, and I get to share this experience with this other person. And my job is seemingly to go out and serve her. What kind of a husband and partner does she deserve to have? And let me see if I can go and be of service to her by bringing that to her. And not what is she going to give me and I need from her. And that, I think, is a byproduct of a lot of work within the steps, and a lot of seeking and building the relationship with my God. And then it allows me to go out in relationship in that way. So I think that's some of what Mike is talking about, where it's like, it's to not make the other person dependent on you, and to not become dependent on another person is a part of freedom in a relationship. But I'll send those questions so we can look at it. And Hitesh had a question, and I want to grab that before I have to jump, although he just put his hand down. But I saw that hand.
Hi, Devin.
Hello, good evening.
This question is put for Devin, you, Karthik, and others who would like to join. My question is, to what extent any entity, whether it's a government entity, any other authority, whether it's a corporate, to what extent we can take their help in
Mm.
terms of material collaterals? I'm not talking about cash as in, but what other resources can we take from them and run a campaign?
So that's a really great question. And it's something has come up, I would say, more recently in the last 5 to or so years. So like, here's a few examples over the years, at least over here. There was requirements for certain public broadcasting, whether it was radio or local access TV. There was a requirement for them, in order to keep their funding and all this stuff, to offer free advertising, is what they would call it, to nonprofits. And AA would always take advantage of that over here. Our general service office would utilize for the local access TV or the local radio, and we had public information stuff that we would put together, which was basically just being able to let the general public know we exist. And certain magazines, they would have to offer some in print, in the back, where the ads, the classifieds and all that stuff would show up, and people would be advertising their businesses. That AA would get a little bit of copy in some of those magazines and some of those newspapers, because that was part of the deal that those that those entities had, in order to be able to keep the public funding and stuff that was coming in. And so Alcoholics Anonymous would always take advantage of that and say, hey, we're a nonprofit. That's really what we are. Our general service office is incorporated as a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation operating in the state of New York. And it's effectively 2 publishing companies. And so we have access to all the benefits that any other nonprofit could. It would be silly for us to not utilize that. And then you could have the argument that sometimes I feel, which is, that's taken something that we don't, that's not us being self-supporting. But then, the business argument is, no, it is. We are a nonprofit. We support, this entity is supported by the groups of Alcoholics Anonymous, and this is something that we can have available to us. And what that's translated to in today's modern world is that Google offers about $10,000 a month in free advertising. And to nonprofits as part of their whole deal. And so AA utilizes that. So we still have, every once in a while, AA, .org or whatever I don't know exactly what it is, but, the general service office or some of the intergroups have access to some of this opportunity to run our public information spots and get highlighted. And so in those situations, AA has seemingly said, we are okay to accept that kind of help that entities offer the nonprofit sector because we're a nonprofit. So it would be stupid for us to not go and do that. But if people ever try to highlight the work we're doing or inquire if we've had awards or things that come to us and they'll say, hey, what does AA think about this? Or we want to recognize you. And we just say like, thank you. But we don't really make, we don't want to get involved with all that stuff again, because we're not trying to become affiliated with outside entities. And we find that if we became beholden, like if we accepted materialistic stuff or we accept too much from anybody, then that might be an opportunity for them to exercise influence over what Alcoholics Anonymous is, which is ultimately what our 10th tradition is pointing us away from. And our 7th tradition, we're self-supporting and we don't have opinion on outside issues because we don't want to become beholden to anybody who could possibly influence what Alcoholics Anonymous is doing. If we became dependent upon the charity of other organizations or other groups to make sure that AA is effectively operating, then when one of those groups comes in and says, we give you a lot of money, and we think, it's like the lobbying that happens in politics and all that kind of stuff, where you have interests of the lobbying interests of companies and people that are giving a bunch and say, well, we give you all this, so now you should give us some. But when it comes to what nonprofits are available to have access to, then AA seems to be able to say, look, if this is available to all nonprofits, we're a nonprofit, we'd be stupid to not make use of this. And we have a need for advertising. We have a need for public information to go out, that kind of stuff. So I don't know if that totally answers the question, but those are at least some
because
of the things that I'm aware
if
of.
we are talking, I was coming to the Google thing. Google gives a lot of credits to individual businesses, individual organizations, entities. So as an individual, I get a lot of credit from Google, for example, not at the GSO level, but as an individual level. So can I use those credits to invite uh, prospective fellows for A?
Well, what kind of credits are they? Or like what kind of, like, what is the
Add
actual,
credits. Add credits.
and is it to you personally? Or is it to you as like a position at like
So
the area?
personally, but we need to do a little bit of work around with that, showing as a small group or NGO kind of, not exactly NGO, but then we have to have some entity, right?
So I guess the
Individually,
first
also
question
they
is,
provide a lot of credits.
yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say is I don't really know if there's a hard and fast rule, and I'm not qualified to say what would or wouldn't be able to do with something that's your own. However, just like if
Mm.
I'm at a meeting and I decide I want to put $50 in the basket instead of $5, I could do that. And as a member, if
Okay.
I'm willing to don't, if I'm willing to contribute in some way to AA, um,
Mm.
that might be useful, then I think that's each of our own choices. But then the problem, or not the problem, but the consideration that I would have is that becoming a thing where I'm saying, look at, I've contributed all this, so I deserve. And I'll start getting in my head because I'm dropping a bunch more money and doing all this other stuff that then am I starting to think that that elevates my status within AA? And that would be, I think, part of the property, the prestige, or the prestige or authority piece here. It's like, oh, I'm a trusted servant, and as a trusted servant, I've got access to some stuff, and I think this could be useful, so let me give it to you, and I don't care about it. Is a little different than like, hey, I think I can use this and try to leverage this to become the important person or the big dog, kind of in quotes.
Yeah, but
So
then
we
that is
can,
a very individualistic, moral related thing. I mean,
yeah,
very individual thing.
and that's where it's like,
Not that
get
the
quiet.
framework stops you from doing that.
Right. Well, it's like get quiet, take it into prayer and meditation and see, do I have some intuition here? And then I'd maybe run it
Mhm.
by some other people locally that are maybe at different
Okay.
avenues of service and say, hey, what do you guys think about this idea? And one of our
Mhm.
great speakers that we had um, for years, a guy named Sandy Beach, and Sandy goes, if you're wondering what's God's will, he goes, when you get these ideas, go run them by a few people, and if they look at you like, what did you just say? It's like you'll quickly start to say some of these ideas, and it might sound nuts. But sometimes we do fall into really, our intuition is spot on. So the book says that becomes a working part of the mind. And if we have some resources that we're not using that could be beneficial, maybe the intuition is, hey, go share this resource that you have access to. If this could be helpful to some people, then wonderful. And if I'm able to give of that for fun and for free, and I'm not expecting a return on it, then I think it's probably a win. But if I'm starting to keep tabs on my kindness and put conditions on all that stuff, well, I'll do all this, but you guys better recognize me at that, the group anniversary. I want a special shout out for all that I gave to this group this year. Then it's okay. That was maybe my ego doing this thing. Um,
Okay.
but so we can dive
This
in some. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
can I take a minute?
Yeah,
He has
We
to
have got
jump
something
though.
like a CSR in.
it's okay. We'll do this. This will be the last thing, and then we can jump back. But go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. There's something called CSR concept in Indian corporates here, which they ought to put some percentage of their earnings into corporate social responsibility that they call. Now, here this is for the society that they are supposed to give back certain things to the society. Now, as A groups, we are not supposed to take any kind of financial help from them, but can we use their resources and they whatever money that they spend on their CSR uh, can be shown as a non-cash related support to A.
That one I don't know. Um, I
From
mean,
A's
maybe we can
perspective.
maybe we can chat a little more next week about like specifically what that stuff looks like. Um,
Hmm.
and it kind of might fall to, hey, if this is something that's available to everybody, it would be silly for us not to try to make use of it. But then the question is like, well, what's an AA group? How are we as an entity? Are we even an entity? If I'm not even an incorporated entity, I'm like a small organization of people. Would I be able to access
Self-help.
that, or how would that even be doable? Um, for me personally, it's like I'd caution against, like, we did this in the pandemic at the office, when we were having all this money stuff that were like giving out all these loans for, businesses and stuff. And it was suggested by apparently our general service office manager, Greg Tobin, at the time, that, it would be stupid for us to not go after getting these loans. And we got given these PPP loans and got a chunk of money from the government
Okay.
because they were offering it to
Okay.
nonprofits, and we applied and got that. And then after a discussion, a bunch of us were like, this feels wrong because we don't need it right now. We're actually are self-supporting, and we took a bunch of money from our government now. And we had a discussion and we brought it to our delegates, and thankfully our delegates voted to return the money, and we did. And I think that was kind of the initial thing, was we said we could apply for it, and if we get it, we can hold it off to the side, and if we end up not needing it, we could return it. Which, in hindsight, was just stupid for us to ever have done. But it was a moment that no one could prepare for. We had no idea what was happening. But so we ended up applying for and getting a loan for our central office. And then the delegates and the steering committee down the road, after some shakeups that happened of the people that were there, our director spiraled out and resigned. And, it was it was a really fun moment of service in AA, that's for sure. It was wild. Um, but we ultimately, as an organization, or the delegates, the groups came back and said, hey, we don't want that money.
Mhm.
If we're self-supporting, we don't want to take all that. And so we'll get to jump into more of that next week, and maybe we can revisit some more of this stuff if you're able to come back.
Sure. Sure.
And
Sure.
maybe we can just get it. So like, what exactly would that help look like? What would
Hmm.
those reasons, what would be
Okay.
those kinds of things? And
Okay. Okay.
and I guess the way I default to is like, we don't really need much. Within AA, like an AA group really shouldn't need much. What I ultimately need is a place to meet. And ideally, we need a little bit of money so we can put out some kind of light refreshment, whether it's a little bit of a snack and some coffee or tea or something. And we just need a spot where we can welcome people in, and as long as we have that going on, and then we're carrying a clear message, then and the spirit is in the meeting, people will show up and be attracted to the spirit. People will be attracted to the laughter and the freedom that they see in others. And people will want to come back, and they will look out and they'll go, man, this is really something. And I think that's really, if that's the focus, is how do we make this an attractive place for people to come back to, not because we're giving them a bunch of free stuff and trying to sell them on something, but just because we're getting together and we're carrying a clear and powerful message, which is that you can be set free here, that you can recover, that you don't have to worry, you don't have to suffer because you have alcoholism, but you can actually learn to live a way of life that will allow you to become happily and usefully whole. And if we're carrying that message and we got a bunch of, a small core of us that are really fired up, that's going to be infectious to people when they're walking off the streets dying of alcoholism. And, we have a group here that, at one point it was like 500 or 600 people came to their Tuesday night meeting. It was filled out this massive church in the middle of the New York City. And, they would have all sorts of coffee, and, every anniversary is massive cakes. And I mean, it was this crazy production, and everyone's dressing up to the meeting, and that's great. And then there's the meeting where it's like 7 people sitting around a big book talking about God and the steps, and that's also great. Um, so yeah, it's like, what do I really need? And with tradition 6 specifically, it would suggest that what I need to do is not become entangled with other entities. And we, as AA, we cooperate. If we can show up and do a present, I was a CPC chair for our area, which is cooperating with professional communities, for not this year, but the last 2 years prior. And I got to go and talk to doctors in residence at a hospital that were becoming like, primary care physicians. And we got to sit down and do like a 90-minute presentation a couple of different times with AA members and talk to them about what Alcoholics Anonymous is, and share some of our stories, and break off into small groups, and give these people faces to sober members of Alcoholics Anonymous in one-on-one conversation. And that's like incredible, and that's, to me,
That
it's
is
like,
exactly what I was in my mind actually. The one
yeah.
that
And
you
so it's like,
mentioned.
that's cooperation. I'm not affiliated with Lenox Hill Hospital, and we made it very clear we're members of Alcoholics Anonymous. We've been invited here to share with you our experience and to let you know the resources that Alcoholics Anonymous is providing for free within your community. And if you leave New York City and you go to somewhere else in this country, to know that Alcoholics Anonymous exists pretty much all over this country and all over Canada and all over the world. And we could just give them that information, right? And in that way, we're cooperating with our friends of the medical community. Where I did one with a bunch of priests within the Catholic Church. We got together. They have their meeting where they got all the people in their district from like 9 or 10 different parishes. There was a bishop there. And we sat down with a chunk of AA members and we said, this is what Alcoholics Anonymous is doing. And this is the work we're trying, that we get done. And this is where you can find us. And this is what, here's my phone number. If you need anything, you can call me. I know people, and so that is how we cooperate. But we're not affiliated with that hospital. We're not affiliated with that sect of religion. But we want to let people know that we exist. And here's what we do. So with that, I do need to jump. I need to run up and get to some work stuff. And
Thank you so much, David.
but thank y'all. This was really fun, and I'll see you guys in a week.